Hi, and welcome back to this segment on development. We are continuing to look at processes that are related to globalization. Now, in this segment, we are going to be talking about development and a very particular type of interpretation of development called modernization. You may have already heard about the terms development and modernization before this. To the average person, the words development or modernization usually mean ways in which the living standard of a set of people can be improved. Okay. However, as students of the sociology of globalization, there is a much more specific interpretation of development and modernization that you need to be aware of. So, let's take a look at the definition of development and modernization. See, essentially, in this class, when we talk about development and modernization, we are talking about a specific perspective that became very popular in the aftermath of the Second World War. Okay, so let's take a look at the definition of this perspective. So, the development perspective was a project primarily concerned with the economic development of specific nation states not regarded as sufficiently developed. In other words, in conceptual terms or in mental terms, the world was, as per this perspective, divided into two sets of countries or nation states. Okay. And it's interesting that this conversation is happening at the level of nation states. Okay, so two sets of countries. One set of countries was the developed countries, and the other set of countries was the underdeveloped or not developed or less developed countries. Okay. Another set of terms that are used to talk about these two is global north. So developed countries were referred to as part of the global north, and the not developed countries were part of the global south. So the argument was that there are two types of countries in the world: global north countries and global south countries. So global north countries have achieved a sufficient level of development, whereas global south countries have not achieved a sufficient level of development. And so the global south countries need to undertake certain steps to become at the level of the global north. So in other words, the global south countries were expected to rise up or catch up with the countries of the global north. Now, how were they expected to do this is very interesting. A little bit of a historical background on how development or modernization perspective came up. As I told you, it emerged in the aftermath or post Second World War II time period, where the countries of Europe were actually completely decimated by the Second World War, right? They had suffered extensive damages, whether you were on the winning side or losing side. And in this context, because the war had not happened on the soil of the United States was actually relatively prosperous. So at this point, the countries of Europe were told to emulate United States, okay, as a model for development. Now, after a while, the rebuilding of the countries of Europe happened, and subsequently the attention shifted towards the countries that had recently become decolonized. If you remember, in the previous segment, we had noted that from the Second World War up till the 1970s, this was an intense period where multiple countries that were colonies earlier became decolonized. So the attention focused on these recently decolonized countries, and then they were told, look, you are experiencing a considerable lack of development, and you have to take certain steps to become like the global north or developed countries. At this point, the global north and developed countries primarily meant the United States and specific countries in Western Europe. Okay. Now, the text actually uses a very interesting phrase, project of rule. Okay. So it argues that actually this whole conversation of development and modernization was a very elitist project, because basically what happened was that the countries of the global north were held up as a model for the countries of the global south, and global south countries were told, look, you, in order to become as economically prosperous as the countries of the global north, you have to emulate those countries in every way, which means that you must actually follow economic policies that are being suggested by countries of the global north. You have to change your social attitudes and become like, adopt the social attitudes that are there in the countries of the global north. You have to change your political systems and become like use whatever systems are used in the countries of the global north, and you have to change your moral outlook as well. Okay, so therefore in some ways the whole idea was that for these global south countries to become, or to actually to for the global south countries to catch up to the global north countries, essentially the global south countries had to become like copies or mirror images of the global north countries. Okay, now if you will notice in this slide, I have actually used the image that I used in the previous segment, this very interesting idea of the white man's burden. In the white man's burden, we saw that these these colonizing countries of Britain and the United States were actually depicted as, taking taking barbaric, uncivilized people from around the world, China, India, various Cuba and other places in Africa. The argument was that, these countries are going to take these uncivilized countries towards civilization, right? So that was actually a story that was very influential, and it was often invoked to justify colonialism. Okay, and you can see that at least some of those ideas continued in this whole development or modernization perspective. Again, the countries of the global south were told that, you have to look at the countries of the global north as a model if you want to catch up and become as economically prosperous. Now, we'll stop here, and in the next segment, we will look at various critiques of this approach of development and modernization that came up.